In this presentation, we're going to look at something called the three-tone method. It's a way of building a painting that allows for a lot of coherence in terms of the values and the colors, and a really good place to start. So first thing I'd like you to do is download the photo from the course website. We're going to be working from this photograph, and I'm going to take you through the steps that we're going to do for this particular painting. So the first thing I want you to do is have your board, you know, your canvas panel or your primed paper attached to a board or loose, entirely up to you. And we're going to start by drawing it. So you're going to draw it with your brush, not with charcoal, not with pencil. You're going to use black and white paint. You're going to dilute it either with water if you're working in acrylics or turpenoid if you're working in oils. And you're just going to, what we call rough in. You're just going to get a basic shape. Now the apple is not actually a circle. It's got all sorts of angular edges, and you can see it's kind of flat along the top right here. So we will come to that in a second. Right now you can just kind of keep its basic shape, which is rather circular, and then the shape of the shadow, and then the line for the back of the table. So put those in until you're happy with it. Once you're happy with it, what we do is we fill in the entire apple. So the three-tone method is based on the idea that we take each section, the main object, the background, the foreground, the shadow, and we give it a value. We look at the picture and we say, okay, what's pretty clear is this is black. All right. This is not really white, but I'm going to use it as white because it's lighter in most of the image. So for the background, the table will make it white. And then we're going to give this a value, kind of a middle value of what it is. Now I know this is a little confusing because it's light and it's dark and it's dark and it's light. There's lots of things happening. But we're going to say, okay, this has got some lights and darks, so we're going to create a sort of middle value for that. What I mean by that is a gray that's in the middle between black and white. So kind of like a middle gray. So what I've done is you just fill in that entire shape. Don't worry about all the details, don't worry about the changes, and this is an important part of learning how to paint, is not to get too bogged down with the details too early. All right, so just lay that in, and then you're going to come to the other sections and do exactly the same. So where it's dark, just make it dark. And again, do not worry too much about the technique, the method, laying it down. So this is called blocking in, where we kind of block in the major shapes without detail and without looking at changes of light and dark. And so what the three-tone method is based on is the idea that you give something a value, kind of its middle value, and then you modify it with darks and with lights. So the first step you're going to do here is you're going to add some darks. All right, so that's where the three tones comes from. The first one is the average, the middle, the basic value of the object, and then the second is the darks, and the third is the lights. So we come in with the darks, and we look at the shape of the darks over here, and we get some shapes up here, and we just kind of throw them in roughly. Don't get too bogged down, again, with details and trying to get it perfectly correct. Just kind of lay that in. And then after you've done the darks, you're going to start coming in with some of the lights. All right, so we see that this side of the object is lighter. So we put you can see the white paint in here, and you can see that it's unblended. It's not manipulated. We're just kind of really basically putting this in. And I really want you to get used to this whole idea of not getting too caught up in being too perfect too soon. That's what's going to hold you back. So as long as you're not wildly off base, you're completely fine. Just keep going. Every layer of this painting is a way of getting it more refined, more detailed, and more accurate in terms of what we're looking for. Okay, so we start with our darks, and then we come in with our lights. And then the next step is really important. We start to, sorry, I'm ahead of myself here. Now once you've got your lights in, then you can start blending a little bit, start blending your darks, start to manipulate them a little bit. And you'll notice something on shadows, which we haven't yet talked about in the course, is that you get something called reflected light. So this is light that's bouncing off of the table onto in this case, the apple. So we want to make sure that we have that. If you look at the apple, the darkest part is right here. That's called the core shadow. It's the darkest part of the shadow. So even though the light's coming from up here, it doesn't mean that your object gets darker and darker and darker and darker and darker as it goes away from the light, because the light responds to the environment. And so we have things like tables and other objects that will reflect and bounce light back onto the object. So you can see here I threw in a little bit of light just to keep that part, light so it doesn't get way too dark. And then this is the important part I was talking about. The background, the context. Too many people work on the object and they get it perfect. And then when they come to the background, the whole thing falls out of whack. So one thing you'll notice here is that the apple is lighter against the background on the right side, but darker against the background on the left side. And then when we come to the bottom, the apple is darker than the background. So along this edge, the relationship changes. It's light apple, dark background, and as we creep down, we have dark apple, light background. You have a hard time seeing that, just squint your eyes. So we need to lay that in. If I go back, if you remember the background, it's just white. So we've done our lights and darks on the apple, but we haven't touched the background yet. So we have to deal with the environment, the context, the background at the same time we're dealing with the objects. So what I've done here is put in some dark. Not too dark, can't be darker than the background, than the black at the top, obviously. And we're going to keep the bottom light. So here we have this relationship established, which is something we need. It's really, really important. And you can see it made a big jump in terms of looking three-dimensional the minute we did that. So then the next few steps really are just ways of refining that. So looking at the blending techniques we did, by taking your brush and going back over and over and over certain areas, you're going to start to develop this softness. All right. So this is a linear style painting. We're not trying to be painterly. We're trying to keep it, kind of blended and soft and linear. You are going to have brush strokes. Don't worry about that. But try to minimize them as much as possible. So you can see this is another stage of development. You've got the dark happening up here, but it's not exactly like this yet. We're keeping it still kind of loose, but we're sort of softening it. So how do you soften it? Well, with your brush, gently touching it, but also by drying your brush and using it as a blender and just kind of wisping over the surface. And then another technique and tool many painters use is their finger. You can bring your finger in to sort of soften a few things, but don't get too caught up with that. You get paint all over yourself, and you get too reliant on using your finger, especially for a linear technique. Now the shadow, notice that it's kind of darker here and lighter here, and it's sharper here and blurrier here. So that's something we find a lot with what are called cast shadows. So this is a shadow that's cast by the object, hence the name cast shadow. So we are going to be darker down here, and then we're going to start to manipulate the shadow by putting in some lights here. And then again, the edge is going to start to be blurry, and you can do that just by going over with your brush. Now this is much easier to do with oil paints because the paints are wet, and so when you're working with wet on wet, it's very forgiving and very easy. When you're working with acrylics, you got to go very fast because this edge starts to dry. All right. So as we progress through the painting, you can see I'm putting more details in. So now the stem of the apple, the cast shadow. Notice there's a shadow there from the little stem sticking out. The highlights come in. Try and leave details like this till the very end of the picture. Don't put them in at the beginning. More development in terms of the shadows that are happening down here, blending out the background, putting a little bit of light in here just to emphasize that edge, using the dark along the top to shape our apple. We started off pretty round, and notice there's a little dip right here in the middle of the apple, which is right here. It's also kind of straight, and another straight line coming down here. So try to look for that, and also we're kind of straight here. So if you look over here, we're getting kind of straight rather than a perfect circle. It's kind of narrower at the bottom, a little bit wider in this region here. And as we progress through the painting, every layer is going to get progressively more and more detail. So you're looking closer and closer. You're seeing that reflected light. You're blending it in. You're looking at the core shadow, the shape, picking up some of these darks right here, working on. Notice that the light's coming from this side, so this part goes into a shadow, but the opposite side goes very, very bright. All right, so a little bit of light happening down in here. And then finally we come to sort of the final resolution. Everything gets softened a little bit. We manipulate things to the point that we're happy with it. Now I'm not wanting you to go spend too much time. If you're spending 5 hours on this, it's probably too much time. just try and give it your best shot. But with the three-tone method, what happens is that the relationships of all the values tends to work because you're taking a general value for the middle average of the object, and then you're darkening it and you're lightening it. So it doesn't go too dark and it doesn't go too light because it's mixing with wet paint, and the same with the rest of them. This might not make a lot of sense to you right now, but it will as you start painting throughout the course, and you'll start to see why, what I mean by keeping that balance between things. In the next technique, sort of patchwork shading technique, you'll see what I mean, where we work on separate pieces, the darks, the middles, and the lights separately. And with that technique, it's very easy to get everything out of whack. It doesn't quite balance and kind of work together and look the same. With value, it's not too complicated, but with color, it gets really, really complicated. All right.